starting at page 687. Fighting in France, belatedly. Russia's collapse underscored the need for haste. The communistic Bolsheviks, after seizing power late in 1917, ultimately withdrew their beaten country from the capitalistic war in early 1918. This sudden defection released hundreds of thousands of battle-tested Germans from the Eastern Front facing Russia for the Western Front in France, where, for the first time in the war, they were developing a dangerous superiority in manpower. Berlin's calculations as to American tardiness were surprisingly accurate. Germany had counted on knocking out Britain 6 months after the declaration of unlimited submarine warfare, long before America could get into the struggle. No really effective American fighting force reached France until about a year after Congress declared war. Berlin had also reckoned on the inability of the Americans to transport their army, assuming that they were able to raise one. Here again, the German predictions were not far from the mark, as shipping shortages plagued the Allies. Nevertheless, France gradually began to bustle with the American doughboys. The first trainees to reach the front were used as replacements in the Allied armies, and were generally deployed in quiet sectors with the British and the French. The newcomers soon made friends with the French girls, or tried to, and one of the most sung about women in history was the fabled Mademoiselle from Armentières. One of the printable stanzas ran, "She was true to me, she was true to you, and she was true to the whole damn army too." Not surprisingly, American soldiers suffered from high rates of venereal diseases, which the army only contributed to by avoiding the subject. American operations were not confined solely to France. Small detachments fought in Belgium, Italy, and notably Russia. The United States, hoping to keep stores of munitions from falling into German hands when the Bolshevik Russians quit fighting, contributed some 5,000 troops to an Allied invasion of northern Russia at Archangel. Wilson likewise sent nearly 10,000 troops to Siberia as a part of an Allied expedition, which included more than 70,000 Japanese. Major American purposes were to prevent Japan from gaining... Major American purposes were to prevent Japan from getting a stranglehold on Siberia, to rescue some 45,000 marooned Czechoslovak troops, and to snatch military supplies from the Bolshevik control. Sharp fighting at Archangel in Siberia involved casualties on both sides, including several hundred Americans. The Bolsheviks long resented these capitalistic interventions, which they regarded as high-handed efforts to suffocate their infant communist revolution in its cradle. America helps hammer the Hun. The dreaded American drive on the Western Front exploded in the spring of 1918, spearheaded by about 500,000 troops. The enemy rolled forward with terrifying momentum. So dire was the peril that the Allied nations, for the first time under a supreme commander, So dire was the peril that the Allied nations, for the first time, united under a supreme commander, the quiet French Marshal Foch, whose axiom was to make war is to attack. Until then, the Allies had been fighting imperfectly coordinated actions. At last, the ill-trained Yanks were coming, and not a moment too soon. Late in May 1918, the German juggernaut, smashing to within 40 miles of Paris, threatened to knock out France. Newly arrived American troops, numbering fewer than 30,000, were thrown into the breach at Chateau Thierry, right into the teeth of German advance. This was a historic moment, the first significant engagement of American troops in a European war. Battle-fatigued French soldiers watched incredulously as the roads filled with endless truckloads of American doughboys, singing New World songs at the top of their voices, a seemingly inexhaustible flood of fresh and gleaming youth. With their arrival, it was clear that a new American giant had arisen in the West to replace the dying Russian titan in the East. American weight in the scales was now being felt on both sides of the conflict. By July 1918, the awesome German drive had spent its force, and keyed-up American men participated in a Foch counteroffensive in the Second Battle of the Marne. This engagement marked the beginning of a German withdrawal that was never effectively reversed. In September 1918, 9 American divisions, about 243,000 men, joined 4 French divisions to push the Germans from the Saint-Mihiel salient, a German dagger in France's flank. The Americans, dissatisfied with merely bolstering the British and French, had meanwhile been demanding a separate army. General John J. Blackjack Pershing was finally assigned to a front of 85 miles, stretching northward from the Swiss border to meet French lines. As part of the last mighty Allied assault, involving several million men, Pershing's army undertook the Meuse Argonne Offensive from September 26th to November 11th, 1918. One objective was to cut the German railroad lines feeding the Western Front. This battle, the most gargantuan thus far in American history, lasted 47 days and engaged 1.2 million American troops. With especially heavy fighting in the rugged Argonne forest, the kills and wounded mounted to 120,000, or 10% of the Americans involved. The slow progress and severe losses from the machine guns resulted in part from inadequate training, in part from dashing open field tactics with bayonet liberally employed. Tennessee bred Alvin C. York, a member of the anti-war religious sect, became a hero when he single-handedly killed 20 Germans and captured 132 more. Victory was in sight, and fortunately so. The slowly advancing American armies in France were eating up their supplies so rapidly that they were in grave danger of running short. But the battered Germans were ready to stagger out of the trenches and cry, "Kamerad, comrade." Their allies were deserting them. The British blockade was causing critical food shortages, and sledgehammer blows of the Allies pummeled them relentlessly. Propaganda leaflets containing seductive Wilsonian promises rained down upon their crumbling lines from balloons, shells, and rockets. The 14 points disarmed Germany. Berlin was now ready to hoist the white flag. Warned of imminent defeat by the generals, it turned to the presumably soft-hearted Wilson in October 19, seeking a peace based on the 14 points. In stern responses, the president made it clear that the Kaiser must be thrown overboard before an armistice could be negotiated. War-weary Germans, whom Wilson had been trying to turn against their military masters, took the hint. The Kaiser was forced to flee to Holland, where he lived out his remaining 23 years, unwept, unhonored, and unhung. The exhausted Germans were through. They laid down their arms at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, and an eerie, numbing silence fell over the Western Front. War-taught America burst into a delirium of around-the-clock rejoicing, as the war to end wars had ended. But the costs exceeded comprehension. Nearly 9 million soldiers had died, and more than 20 million had suffered grievous wounds. To make matters worse, some 30 million people perished in a worldwide influenza pandemic in 1918 to 1919. Over 550,000 Americans, more than 10 times the number of the U.S. combat casualties, died from the flu. The United States' main contribution to the ultimate victory had been foodstuffs, munitions, credits, oil for the first mechanized war, and manpower, but not battlefield victories. The Yanks fought only 2 major battles, at St. Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne, both in the last 2 months of the 4-year war, and they were still grinding away in the Meuse-Argonne, well short of their objectives, when the war had ended. It was the prospect of endless U.S. troop reserves, rather than America's actual military performance, that eventually demoralized the Germans. Ironically enough, General Pershing in some ways depended more on the Allies than they depended on him. His army purchased more of its supplies in Europe than it shipped from the United States. Fewer than 500 of Pershing's artillery pieces were part of American manufacturing. Virtually all of his aircraft were provided by the British and the French. Britain and France transported a majority of the doughboys to Europe. The United States, in short, was no arsenal of democracy in this war. The role that awaited it was in the next global conflict, 2 decades later. Wilson steps down from the Olympus. Woodrow Wilson had helped win the war. What part would he now play in shaping the peace? Expectations ran extravagantly high as the fighting in Europe crashed to a close. The American president towered at the peak of his popularity and power. In lonely huts in the mountains of Italy, candles burned before the poster portraits of the revered American prophet. In Poland, starry-eyed university students would meet in the streets, clasp hands, and utter only one word: Wilson. No other man had ever occupied so dizzy a pinnacle as a moral leader of the world. Wilson also had behind him a prestige of victory and the economic resources of the mightiest nation on earth. But at this fateful moment, his sureness of touch deserted him, and he began to make a series of tragic fumbles. Under the slogan, "Politics is adjourned," partisan political strife had been kept below the surface during the war crisis. Hoping to strengthen his hand at the Paris peace table, Wilson broke the truce by personally appealing for a Democratic victory in the congressional elections of November 1918. But the maneuver backfired when voters instead returned a narrow Republican majority to Congress. Having staked his reputation on the outcome, Wilson went to Paris as a diminished leader. Unlike all the parliamentary statesmen at the table, he did not command a legislative majority at home. Wilson's decision to go in person to Paris to help make the peace infuriated Republicans. At the time, no president had traveled to Europe, and Wilson's journey had looked to his critics like flamboyant grandstanding. He further ruffled Republican feathers when he snubbed the Senate in assembling his peace delegation and neglected to include a single Republican senator in his official party. The logical choice was the new chairman of Senate on Foreign Relations, slender and aristocratically bewhiskered Henry Cabot Lodge, Massachusetts, a Harvard Ph.D. But including Lodge would have been problematic for the president. The senator's mind, quipped one critic, was like the soil of his native New England, naturally barren but highly cultivated. Wilson loathed him, and the feeling was hardly reciprocated. An accomplished author, Lodge had been known as a scholar in politics until Wilson came on the scene. The two men were at daggers drawn, personally and politically. An idealist among the imperialists. Woodrow Wilson, the great prophet arisen in the West, received tumultuous welcomes from the masses of France, England, and Italy late in 1918 and early in 1919. They saw in his idealism the promise of a better world, but the statesmen of France and Italy were careful to keep the new Messiah at arm's length from worshipful crowds. He might so rouse the people as to prompt them to overthrow their leaders and upset fine-spun imperialistic plans. The Paris Conference of great and small nations fell into the hands of an inner clique known as the Big Four. Wilson, representing the richest and freshest great power, more or less occupied the driver's seat. He was joined by the genial Premier Vittorio Orlando of Italy and brilliant Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain. Perhaps the most realistic of the quartet was cynical, hard-bitten Premier Georges Clemenceau of France, the 78-year-old organizer of victory known as the Tiger. Speed was urgent when the conference opened on January 18, 1919. Europe seemed to be slipping into anarchy. The red tide of communism was licking westward from Bolshevist Russia. Wilson's ultimate goal was world parliament, to be known as the League of Nations, but he first spent his energies to preventing any vengeful parceling out of former colonies and the protectorates of the vanquished powers. He was less attentive to the fate of colonies belonging to the victorious French and English. Wilson tried to force through a compromise between naked imperialism and Wilsonian idealism. The victors would not take the possessions of the conquered territory outright, but receive it as trustees of the League of Nations. Strategic Syria, for example, was awarded to France, and oil-rich Iraq went to Britain. In practice, this half-loaf solution was a little more than old pre-war colonialism thinly disguised, although in the decades to come, anti-colonial independent movements would wield the Wilsonian ideals of self-determination against their imperial occupiers. Meanwhile, Wilson had been serving as a midwife for the League of Nations, which he envisioned as containing an assembly with seats for all nations and council to be controlled by the great powers. He gained a single victory over the skeptical Old West diplomats in February 1919, when they agreed to make the Leave Covenant, Wilson's brainchild, an integral part of the final peace treaty. At one point, he spoke with such ardor for his plan that even the hard-boiled newspaper reporters forgot to take notes. Hammering out the treaty. Diplomatic duties now required Wilson to make a quick trip to America, where ugly storms were brewing in the Senate. Certain Republican senators, Lodge in the lead, were sharpening their knives for Wilson. To them, the League was either a useless sewing circle or an overpotent superstate. Their hardcore was composed of a dozen or so militant isolationists, led by Senators Wilson Borah of Idaho and Hiram Johnson of California, who was known as the Irreconcilables, the Battalion of Death. Wow. 39 Republican senators, or senators-elect, enough to defeat a treaty. proclaimed that the Senate would not approve of the League of Nations in its existing imperfect form. These difficulties delighted Wilson's allied adversaries in Paris. They were now in a stronger bargaining position because Wilson would have to beg them for changes in the covenants that would safeguard the Monroe Doctrine and other American interests dear to the senators. As soon as Wilson was back in Paris, the hard-headed Clemenceau pressed French demands for the German-inhabited Rhineland and the Saar Valley, a coal-rich area. Faced with fierce Wilsonian opposition to this violation of self-determination, France settled for a compromise whereby the Saar Basin would remain under the League of Nations for 15 years, and then a popular vote would determine its fate. And apparently they did a vote to rejoin Germany in 1935. In exchange for dropping its demands for Rhineland, France got the Security Treaty, in which both Britain and America pledged to come to its aid in the event of another German invasion. The French later felt betrayed when this pact was quickly pigeonholed by the U.S. Senate, which shied away from all entangling alliances. Wilson's next battle was with Italy over Fiume, a valuable seaport inhabited both by Italians and Yugoslavs. When Italy demanded Fiume, Wilson insisted that the seaport go over to Yugoslavia and appealed over the heads of Italy's leaders to the country's masses. The maneuver fell flat. The Italian delegates went home in a huff, while the Italian masses turned savagely against Wilson. Another critical struggle was with Japan over China's Shandong, that's embarrassing, peninsula, and the German islands in the Pacific, which the Japanese had seized during the war. Japan was conceded the strategic Pacific Islands under a League of Nations mandate, but Wilson staunchly opposed Japanese control of Shandong as a violation of self-determination for its 30 million Chinese residents. But when the Japanese threatened to walk out, Wilson reluctantly accepted a compromise whereby Japan kept Germany's economic holdings in Shandong and pledged to return the peninsula to China at a later date. The Chinese were outraged by this imperialistic solution, while Clemenceau jeered that Wilson talked like Jesus and acted like Lloyd George. The peace treaty that bred a new war. A completed Treaty of Versailles after more weeks of wrangling was handed to the Germans in June 1919, almost literally on a point of a bayonet. Excluding from the settlement negotiations at Paris, Germany had capitulated in the hope that it would be granted a peace based on the 14 points. A careful analysis of the treaty showed that only about 4 of the 23 original Wilsonian points and subsequent principles were fully honored. Vengeance, not reconciliation, was the treaty's dominant tone. Loud and bitter cries of betrayal burst from German throats, charges that Adolf Hitler would soon reiterate during his meteoric rise to power. Wilson, of course, was guilty of no conscious betrayal, but the Allied powers were torn by conflicting aims, many of them sanctioned by secret treaties. There had to be compromise at Paris, or there would be no agreement. Faced with hard realities, Wilson was forced to compromise away some of his less cherished 14 points in order to salvage the more precious League of Nations. He was much like the mother who had to throw her sickly child to the pursuing wolves to save her sturdy firstborn. A troubled Wilson was not happy with the results. Greeted a few months later with a frenzied acclaim in Europe, he was now a fallen idol, condemned alike by disillusioned liberals and frustrated imperialists. He was keenly aware of some of the injustices that had been forced into the treaty, but he was hoping that the League of Nations, a potent league with America as its leader, would iron out the inequalities. Yet, the loudly condemned treaty had much to commend it. Not least among its merits was its liberation of millions of minority peoples, such as the Poles, from the yoke of imperial dynasties. Wilson's disappointments and his critics to the contrary, the settlement was almost certainly a fairer one because he had gone to Paris. The domestic parade of prejudice. Returning for the second and final time to America, Wilson sailed straight into a political typhoon. Isolationists raised a whirlwind of protest against the treaty, especially against Wilson's commitment to usher the United States into the newfangled League of Nations. Invoking a revered advice of Washington and Jefferson, they wanted no part of any entangling alliance. Nor were the isolationists Wilson's only problem. Critics showered the Treaty of Versailles with abuse from all sides. Rabid Hun haters, regarding the pact as not harsh enough, voiced their discontent. Principled liberals, like the editors of the New York Nation, thought it was too harsh and a gross betrayal to boot. German Americans, Italian Americans, and others whom Wilson themed hyphenated Americans were aroused because the peace settlement not only sufficiently favored and others who Wilson termed hyphenated Americans were aroused because the peace settlement was not sufficiently favorable to their native lands. Irish Americans, traditional twisters of the British lion tail, denounced the League. They also felt that the additional votes of the 5 overseas Britain Irish Americans, traditional twisters of the British lion tail, also denounced the League. They felt that with the additional votes of the 5 overseas British dominions, it gave Britain undue influence, and they feared that it could be used to force the United States to crush any rising for Irish independence. Crowds of Irish American zealots hissed and booed Wilson's name. Wilson's tour and collapse, 1919. Despite mounting discontent, the president had reason to feel optimistic. When he brought home the treaty with the Wilson League, firmly riveted as in Part 1, a strong majority of the people still seemed favorable. At this time, early July 1919, Senator Lodge had no real hope of defeating the Treaty of Versailles. His strategy was merely to amend it to a way as to Americanize, Republicanize, or senatorialize it. The Republicans could then claim political credits for the change. Lodge effectively used delay to muddle and divide public opinion. He read the entire 264-page treaty aloud in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and protracted hearings in which people of various nationalities aired their grievances. Wilson fretted increasingly as the hot summers of 1919 wore on. The bulky pact was bogged down in the Senate, while the nation was drifting in confusion and apathy. He therefore decided to take his case to the country in a spectacular speech-making tour. He would appeal over the heads of the Senate to the sovereign people, as he often had in the past. The strenuous barnstorming campaign was undertaken in the face of protests by physicians and friends. Wilson had never been robust. He had entered the White House nearly 7 years before with the stomach pump and headache pills for his neuritis. His frail body had begun to sag under the strain of partisan strife, a global war, and stressful peace conferences. But he declared that he was willing to die, like the soldiers he had sent into battle, for the sake of the New World Order. The presidential tour, begun in September 1919, got off to a rather lame start. The Midwest received Wilson lukewarmly, partly because of its strong German-American influence. Trailing after him like bloodhounds came 2 irreconcilable senators, Borah and Johnson, who spoke in the same cities a few days later. Hat-tossing crowds answered their attacks on Wilson, crying, "Impeach him, impeach him." But the reception was different in the Rocky Mountain region and the Pacific Coast. These areas, which had elected Wilson in 1916, welcomed him with heartwarming outbursts. The high point and the breaking point of the return trip was the Pueblo, Colorado, September 25th, 1919. Wilson, with tears coursing down his cheeks, pleaded for the League of Nations as the only real hope of preventing future wars. That night, he collapsed from physical and nervous exhaustion. Wilson was whisked back in a funeral train to Washington, where several days later, a stroke paralyzed one side of his body. During the next few weeks, he laid in a darkened room in the White House, as a victim of the war as much a victim of the war as the unknown soldier buried at Arlington. For more than 7 months, he did not meet with his cabinet. Defeat through deadlock. Senator Lodge, coldly calculating, was now at the helm. After failing to amend the treaty outright, he finally came up with the 14 reservations to it, a sardonic slap at Wilson's 14 points. These safeguards reserved the rights of the United States under the Monroe Doctrine and the Constitution and otherwise sought to protect American sovereignty. Senator Lodge and other critics were especially alarmed by the Article X of the League because it was morally bound to the United States to aid any member victimized by external aggression. A jealous Congress wanted to reserve for itself the constitutional war declaring power. Wilson, hating Lodge, saw red at the mere suggestion of the Lodge reservations. To repeat that, Wilson, hating Lodge, saw red at the mere suggestion of Lodge reservations. He was quite willing to accept somewhat similar reservations sponsored by his faithful Democratic followers, but he insisted that Lodge reservations emasculated the entire pact. Although too feeble to lead, Wilson was still strong enough to obstruct. When the day finally came for the voting in the Senate, he sent word to all true Democrats to vote against the treaty with the odious Lodge reservations attached. Wilson hopes that when these were cleared away, the path would be open for ratification without reservations, or with only some mild Democratic ones. Loyal Democrats in the Senate on November 19, 1919, blindly did Wilson's bidding. Combining with the irreconcilables, mostly Republicans, they rejected the treaty with the Lodge reservations appended, 55 to 39. The nation was too deeply shocked to accept the verdict as final. About 4/5 of the senators professed to favor the treaty, with or without reservations, yet a simple majority could not agree on a single proposition. So strong was public indignation that the Senate was forced to act a second time. In March 1920, the treaty was brought up again, with the Lodge reservations tacked on. There was only one possible path to success. Unless the Senate approved the pact with reservations, the entire document would have to be rejected. But the sickly Wilson, still sheltered behind drawn curtains and blind to disagreeable realities, again sent word to all loyal Democrats to vote down the treaty with the obnoxious reservations. He thus signed the death warrant of the treaty as far as America was concerned. On March 19, 1920, the treaty netted a simple majority but failed to get the necessary two-thirds majority by a count of 49 to 49 yeas to 35 nays. Who defeated the treaty? The Lodge-Wilson personal feud, traditionalism, isolationism, disillusionment, and partisanship all contributed to the confused picture, but Wilson himself must bear a substantial share of the responsibility. He asked for all or nothing, and got nothing. One Democratic senator angrily charged that the president had strangled his own brainchild with his own palsied hands rather than let the Senate straighten its crooked limbs. The solemn referendum of 1920. Wilson had his own pet solution for the deadlock, and this partly explains why he refused to compromise on Lodge's terms. He proposed to settle the treaty issue in the forthcoming presidential campaign of 1920 by appealing to the people for a solemn referendum. This was sheer folly, for a true mandate on the League in the noisy arena of politics was clearly an impossibility. Jubilant Republicans gathered in Chicago in June 1920 with wayward bull moosers back in the corral after Theodore Roosevelt's death in 1919, and the senatorial old guard back into the saddle. The convention devised a masterfully ambiguous platform that could appeal to both pro-League and anti-League sentiment in the party. The nation would run on a teeter-totter rather than a platform. As the leading presidential contestants jousted with one another, the political weather vane began to veer towards Senator Warren G. Harding of Ohio. A group of Senate bosses, meeting rather casually in the historic smoke-filled room 404 of the Hotel Blackstone, informally decided on the affable and malleable Ohioan. Malleable Ohioan. Their fair-haired boy was a prosperous, backslapping, small-town newspaper editor of the folksy type, quite the opposite of Wilson, who had earlier noted the senator's disturbingly dull mind. For vice president, the party nominated frugal, grim-faced Governor Calvin, Silent Cal, Coolidge of Massachusetts, who had attracted conservative support by breaking a police strike in Boston. Meeting in San Francisco, Democrats nominated Governor James M. Cox of Ohio, who strongly supported the League. His running mate was Assistant Navy Secretary Franklin D. Roosevelt, a young, handsome, vibrant New Yorker. Democratic attempts to make the campaign a referendum on the League were thwarted by Senator Harding, who issued muddled and contradictory statements on the issue from his front porch. Pro-League and anti-League Republicans both claimed that Harding's election would advance their cause, while the candidate suggested that if if elected, he would work for a vague association of nations, a league, but not the league. With newly enfranchised women swelling the vote totals, Harding was swept into power with a prodigious plurality of over 7 million votes. 16,143,407 to 9,130,328 for Cox, the largest victory margin to that date in a presidential election. The electoral count was 404 to 127. Eugene V. Debs, federal prisoner number 9,653 at the Atlanta Penitentiary, rolled up the largest vote ever for the left-wing Socialist Party, 919,799. Was he in jail when he ran? Public desire for a change found vent in a resounding repudiation of high and mighty Wilsonianism. People were tired of professional highbrowism, star-reaching idealism, bothersome do-goodism, moral overstrain, and constant self-sacrifice. Eager to lapse back into normalcy, they were willing to accept a second-rate president, and they got a third-rate one. Although the election could not be considered a true referendum, Republican isolationists successfully turned Harding's victory into a death sentence for the League. Politicians increasingly shunned the League as they were a leper. As they would a leper. When the legendary Wilson died in 1924, admirers knelt in the snow outside his Washington home. His great vision for a League of Peace had perished long before. The betrayal of great expectations. America's spurning of the League was tragically short-sighted. The Republic had helped to win a costly war, but it foolishly kicked the fruits of victory under the table. Whether a strong international organization would have averted World War II in 1939 will always be a matter of dispute, but there can be no doubt that the orphaned League of Nations was undercut at the start by the refusal of the mightiest power on the globe to join it. The Allies themselves were largely to blame for the New World conflagration that flared up in 1939, but they found a convenient justification for their own shortcomings by pointing an accusing finger at Uncle Sam. The ultimate collapse of the Treaty of Versailles must be laid, at least in some degree, at America's doorstep. The complicated pact, tied in with 4 other peace treaties of the League Covenant, was a top-heavy structure designed to rest on a 4-legged table. The 4th leg, the United States, was never put into place. This rickety structure teetered for over a decade